The gravel crunches. That's the sound you need to remember. Not a scream, not a gunshot. Just gravel crunching under bicycle tires on a quiet Sunday evening in October 1983. 3 boys are pedaling home. The oldest is 11. His name is Jacob, and in less than 5 minutes, he will be gone forever. The sky is bruised purple, the kind of twilight that makes parents call their children inside. But this is Minneapolis in the 80s. Doors don't lock. Kids roam free. The worst thing that happens here is a scraped knee or a broken curfew. Jacob's younger brother Trevor is behind him, breathing hard to keep up. Their friend Kaylin is laughing about something stupid, maybe a joke from the movie they just rented. Maybe nothing at all. The kind of laughter that dies in your throat when you realize it was the last normal moment you'll ever have. They're almost home, almost safe. And then the gravel crunches differently. Heavier. Slower. A man steps out from the shadows between the trees. He's wearing a mask. He's holding a gun. His voice is low, controlled, and it doesn't shake. He's done this before. Get off your bikes, now. 3 boys freeze. 3 hearts stop beating for just a second. This isn't supposed to happen here. This is the kind of thing that happens in big cities, to other families, in other neighborhoods, but it's happening right now. The man looks at them, really looks like he's selecting fruit at a grocery store. Trevor, Kaylin, Jacob. His eyes linger on Jacob. You too? Run. Don't look back or I'll shoot. Trevor and Kaylin run. They crash through the woods, branches tearing at their faces, lungs screaming. When they finally stop and turn around, the road is empty. Jacob is gone. The man is gone, and 15 years of hell are just beginning. What if the monster isn't a stranger? What if he's the guy who waves at you from his driveway every morning? What if he's the man standing behind you in line at the hardware store, making small talk about the weather? What if he's been there all along, blending in, waiting? Have you ever let your child ride their bike to the store? Have you ever said, it's just around the corner, be back before dark? Have you ever watched them pedal away and felt that tiny flicker of worry, then pushed it down because nothing bad happens in your neighborhood? Jacob's parents felt that way too. That Sunday evening in 1983, they weren't worried. It was a short trip, a few blocks. Their boys had made it 100 times before. The streetlights were coming on. Dinner was waiting. Everything was normal. Until it wasn't. Because the man who took Jacob wasn't a drifter passing through town. He wasn't some shadowy figure from the news who lived in a different state, a different world. He was local. He shopped at the same stores. He drove the same roads. He breathed the same air. And for 15 years, he walked free while an entire state tore itself apart, looking for him. This is the story of how a community lost its innocence in a single night. How a family fought for justice when everyone else had given up. And how the man responsible hid in plain sight, confident that time would bury his secrets forever. He was wrong, but what it took to prove that what it cost will shake you to your core. Subscribe now, because the predator in your neighborhood won't announce himself first. This isn't just a story about something that happened decades ago in a place you've never been. This is a blueprint, a warning, a pattern that's repeated in towns across this country more times than you want to know. The man who took Jacob didn't look dangerous. He didn't act suspicious. He was normal, invisible, the kind of person you'd forget 5 seconds after meeting him. And that's exactly what made him so deadly. For 15 years, investigators chased ghosts. They followed thousands of leads that went nowhere. They searched fields, quarries, abandoned buildings. They interrogated suspects who had nothing to do with it while the real killer went to work every day, came home every night, and probably watched the news coverage with a cup of coffee in his hand. The arrest, when it finally came in 1998, sent shockwaves through Minnesota. Not because of who he was, but because of who he wasn't. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't the obvious suspect. He wasn't the man everyone had been looking for. He was the man nobody noticed. And here's the part that will keep you up at night. The clues were there from the beginning. The patterns, the red flags, the moments when investigators were so close they could have reached out and touched him, but they missed it. Not because they weren't trying, not because they didn't care, But because he understood something most people don't, the best hiding place is in plain sight. The man they arrested, he'd been there all along. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're rewatching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. October 1983. The outskirts of Minneapolis felt less like a city and more like a collection of small towns that had grown into each other without losing their roots. This was a place where screen doors stayed unlatched through the night, where the milkman still made deliveries before dawn, and where your neighbor's business was your business, but in the good way, the way that meant someone was always watching out for your kids. Saturday mornings, children poured out of houses like water from a broken dam. They'd be gone until lunch, then gone again until the streetlights buzzed to life. Parents didn't panic. They didn't hover. The worst thing that could happen was a kid coming home with muddy jeans or a scraped elbow from climbing trees near the creek. Trust was the currency everyone traded in. You could leave your car running outside the grocery store while you ran in for milk. You could send your 11-year-old to the convenience store with a $5 bill and know they'd come back with exactly what you asked for, plus the correct change. You could fall asleep with your windows open and wake up to nothing more threatening than the sound of a dog barking 3 houses down. The neighborhood where Jacob lived was the embodiment of that trust. Oak trees lined the streets, their branches forming canopies that turned the roads into tunnels of gold and rust every autumn. Houses sat close enough that you could smell what your neighbors were cooking for dinner. Kids moved in packs, a rotating cast of brothers, sisters, and friends who knew every shortcut, every good hiding spot, every house that gave out full-size candy bars on Halloween. It was the kind of place where people said, nothing bad ever happens here, and they meant it. They believed it down to their bones, but belief doesn't stop a predator. It just makes him harder to see. On that Sunday evening in late October, the air had the sharp bite of approaching winter. Leaves crunched underfoot. Pumpkins sat on porches, some already carved, some still waiting. The sun was setting earlier now, pulling darkness across the sky like a curtain closing on a stage. And nobody knew they were living in the last hours of the world as they knew it. Jacob was 11 years old, with a smile that could disarm anyone who tried to stay mad at him. His hair was perpetually messy, the kind of chaos that came from running everywhere instead of walking. He had freckles across his nose that darkened every summer and faded every winter, a calendar of seasons written on his face. His laugh was the kind that made other people laugh, even if they didn't know what was funny. It was loud, unfiltered, and completely genuine. The laugh of a kid who hadn't learned to be self-conscious yet. Teachers loved him. Other kids gravitated toward him. He was the type of boy who could turn a boring afternoon into an adventure just by suggesting they explore the creek or build a fort in someone else's backyard. Music filled the house most evenings. Jacob had taken up the trombone in school band, and while he wasn't a prodigy, he practiced with the determination of someone who genuinely wanted to get better. The low, brassy notes would drift through the open windows, mixing with the sounds of dinner being prepared and his younger brother Trevor complaining about homework. Trevor idolized Jacob the way younger brothers do. He copied the way Jacob wore his baseball cap. He laughed at Jacob's jokes even when he didn't understand them. He followed Jacob everywhere, a shadow that Jacob tolerated with the patience of someone who understood what it meant to be looked up to. Their friend Kalen lived 3 houses down. He was the same age as Trevor, quieter than Jacob, but just as loyal. The 3 of them had spent the summer riding bikes, playing pickup baseball games in empty lots, and staying outside until the last possible second before curfew. That Sunday, they'd been restless. The kind of restless that comes when you're young and the weekend is almost over, and you want to squeeze one more. Adventure out of it before Monday arrives. Renting a movie seemed like the perfect plan, something easy, something fun, something they'd done a dozen times before without incident. Jacob grabbed his jacket. Trevor grabbed his. Kalen met them in the driveway. 3 boys, 3 bikes, 1 short trip. It should have been nothing. The video store was less than a mile away. 10 minutes there, 10 minutes back. They'd made the trip so many times they could do it with their eyes closed. Jacob's mother stood at the kitchen window, watching them push off down the driveway. She felt that familiar tug, the one every parent knows, but she pushed it away. They were responsible kids. They knew to stay together. They knew to come straight home. The sun was already low, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. Shadows stretched long across the lawns, reaching toward the street like fingers. The temperature had dropped enough that you could see your breath if you exhaled hard enough. October in Minneapolis meant layers, hoodies, underjackets. The smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys, the crunch of fallen leaves under tires. The boys pedaled in formation, Jacob in front because he was always in front, Trevor and Kaylin side by side behind him. They talked about the movie they were going to rent. They argued about which one was better. They made plans for the rest of the evening, pop some popcorn. Maybe convince Jacob's parents to let them stay up late since there was no school. Tomorrow. Normal. Comfortable. Safe. The video store was bright and warm, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. They picked their movie quickly, something with action, something they could quote at school on Monday. The clerk barely looked up as they paid, handing over crumpled dollar bills and loose change pulled from pockets. The ride back started the same way the ride there had ended. Easy, uneventful. But the sky had darkened faster than they'd expected. The purple had deepened to black, swallowing the remaining light. The streetlights were flickering on one by one, pools of yellow breaking up the darkness. Between those pools, the shadows grew thicker. The gravel road that cut through the empty lot was a shortcut they'd used 100 times. It shaved 2 minutes off the trip. Trees lined both sides, tall and skeletal, their bare branches clicking against each other in the wind that had picked up. Trevor felt it first, that prickle on the back of his neck that tells you something is wrong, even when you can't and see what it is. He pedaled faster, trying to catch up to Jacob. Kaylin felt it too. The air had changed. The comfortable silence had turned heavy. Jacob was focused on the road ahead, his front tire kicking up small stones that pinged against the bike frame. None of them saw the man until he was already standing in front of them. Stop for a second and think about the last time you sent someone you love out the door. Did you hug them? Did you say, "Be careful"? Did you watch them leave? Or were you already thinking about what you needed to do next? Jacob's mother didn't know that glance out the kitchen window would be the last time she'd see her son alive. How could she? Every parent has watched their child ride away 1,000 times. Every single one of those times, the child came back. Until the time they don't. That's the thing about tragedy. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't give you a chance to prepare, to say the right words, to hold on a little tighter. It just happens in the space between one breath and the next. On an ordinary evening that should have been forgettable. One moment, you're a family of 5 sitting down to dinner. The next moment, you're a family of 4 sitting in a police station, trying to explain to officers what your son was wearing, how tall he is, whether he has any identifying marks, while your brain screams that this can't be real, that he's going to walk through the door any second with that grin and that messy hair and a reasonable explanation for why he's late. But he doesn't walk through the door. And the officers stop asking questions in present tense and start asking them in past tense. And that's when you know. The figure stepped out from between 2 oak trees like he'd been part of the landscape all along. Trevor saw him first, a dark shape separating itself from the darker shadows. For half a second, his brain tried to make it something harmless. A neighbor taking out trash, someone walking their dog. Anything except what it actually was. But then the shape moved into the weak light spilling from a distant porch, and Trevor's stomach dropped. The man was wearing a mask. Not a Halloween mask, not something theatrical. This was functional, deliberate black fabric pulled tight over his face with crude holes cut for eyes and mouth. The kind of thing someone wears when they don't want to be remembered. He was average height, average build. The kind of person you'd pass on the street and forget before you turn the corner. He wore dark clothes that blended with the night jeans, a jacket, boots that made almost no sound on the gravel. But it was the gun that stopped all 3 boys cold. It caught the light from somewhere, a street lamp half a block away, maybe the moon, and gleamed dull silver. He held it low, relaxed, like it was an extension of his... like he'd held it before, like he knew exactly what he was doing with it. Get off your bikes. His voice was wrong. That's what Trevor would tell police later, over and over, trying to explain something he didn't have words for. The voice was too calm, too controlled. There was no anger in it, no panic, no emotion at all. It was the voice of someone giving instructions at work, telling you where to file paperwork or how to operate a machine. Except the instruction was to get off their bikes in the middle of a dark road with a gun pointed at them. Jacob's bike clattered to the gravel first. The sound was too loud, too sharp. Trevor and Kaylin followed, their hands shaking so badly they nearly dropped their bikes instead of setting them down, face down, on the ground. Now, the gravel bit into Trevor's cheek. Small stones pressed into his palms. He could hear Kaylin breathing fast and shallow beside him, could hear Jacob's breath somewhere to his left. His own heart was hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. The man's boots crunched closer, slow, methodical. He was taking his time. Trevor pressed his face harder into the gravel, eyes squeezed shut. Maybe if he didn't look, this would stop being real. Maybe he'd open his eyes and he'd be back home, safe in bed, waking up from a nightmare. The footsteps stopped. Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Trevor could hear everything, the wind moving through the bare branches overhead, the distant hum of a car on the main road, Kaylin's ragged breathing turning into barely suppressed sobs. Then the man spoke again. "You? Stand up?" Trevor didn't know who he meant. He stayed frozen, praying it wasn't him. The short one, "You, get up." Kaylin made a sound, half gasp, half whimper, and Trevor heard him scramble to his feet. Gravel scattered under his shoes. "How old are you?" 10. Kaylin's voice cracked on the word. A pause, long enough that Trevor's lungs started burning from holding his breath. "Go stand over there." Footsteps. Kaylin moving away. Still crying, trying to muffle it, failing. The man's boots moved again. Closer to Trevor this time. "You." The other short one. Up. Trevor's legs barely held him when he stood. The world tilted. He locked his knees to keep from collapsing. The man was close enough now that Trevor could smell him. Cigarettes and something else. Something chemical and sharp. Sweat. Fear has a smell, and Trevor could smell his own mixing with whatever the man was giving off. "How old?" 9. Trevor's voice came out as a whisper. The man stared at him through those crude eye holes. Trevor couldn't see his eyes, just darkness where eyes should be. It was worse than seeing them. "You run, both of you. Into the woods. Don't stop. Don't look back. If you look back, I'll shoot. You understand?" Trevor nodded. His neck felt like it might snap. "Then run." Trevor didn't think. His body just moved, legs pumping before his brain caught up. Kaylin was beside him, both of them crashing through the undergrowth at the edge of the road. Branches whipped at their faces. Tree roots tried to trip them. The darkness was complete here, away from the road, but they didn't slow down. Behind them, on that gravel road, Jacob was still lying face down. They ran for what felt like forever, but was probably less than a minute. When Trevor's lungs finally gave out and he collapsed behind a fallen log, Kaylin dropped beside him. They lay there gasping, listening for footsteps, for gunshots, for anything. The forest was silent except for their breathing. Trevor raised his head slowly. Through the gaps in the trees, he could see back to the road. The weak light from the distant street lamp illuminated an empty stretch of gravel. No man, no Jacob, no bikes, nothing. Trevor's mind couldn't process what he was seeing. The empty road. The absence where his brother should be. Where... Kellen's voice cracked. "Where's Jacob?" Trevor didn't answer. He was staring at that empty stretch of gravel, waiting for Jacob to appear, to stand up from wherever he'd been hiding, to call out that it was okay to come back now. Nothing moved. "We have to go back," Kaylin whispered. "He said he'd shoot if we looked back. But Jacob, I know." They stayed frozen behind that log for seconds that stretched into something that felt like hours. Every sound made them flinch. A branch creaking, an owl somewhere in the distance, their own heartbeats pounding in their ears. Finally, Trevor made himself stand. His legs were shaking so badly he had to lean against a tree. "Stay here," he told Kaylin. "Don't leave me. Just stay here. I'll look." Trevor moved through the trees slowly, each step deliberate, ready to drop and hide at any sound. The gravel road came back into view between the trunks. Still empty? He moved closer, emerging from the tree line onto the shoulder. The bikes were gone. All three of them. Jacob was gone. The man was gone. The only evidence anything had happened at all was the scuff marks in the gravel where they'd been forced to lie down. And even this could have been from anything. A car pulling over, kids playing, nothing at all. Trevor's brain tried to rewrite what had happened. Maybe Jacob ran in a different direction. Maybe he was hiding somewhere waiting for the man to leave. Maybe Trevor. Kellen's shout from the woods snapped him back. They ran then. Not away from the road this time, but along it toward home. Their legs burned. Their lungs screamed. Neither of them cared. The house appeared a head-warm light glowing from the windows, the porch light on, everything exactly as they'd left it 20 minutes ago when the world was still normal. Trevor hit the front door so hard it slammed against the wall. His mother looked up from the kitchen, startled, her smile already forming because her boys were home. Then she saw their faces. "Where's Jacob?" Trevor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The words were there, a mask, a gun, but his throat had closed around them. Kaylin started crying again, huge gasping sobs that bent him double. Trevor's mother's face changed. The color drained from it in an instant, leaving her gray, her eyes wide and terrified because she already knew. Even before Trevor finally managed to force the words out, a man took him, a man with a gun. He took Jacob, a man. The 911 call went out at 9:17 p.m. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood transformed into chaos. Squad cars screamed down streets that rarely saw traffic faster than 15 miles per hour. Red and blue lights strobed across house fronts, pulling neighbors from their Sunday evening routines onto porches and lawns. Sheriff Baxter Vance arrived 12 minutes after the initial call. He found Trevor and Kaylin in the living room, wrapped in blankets despite the house being warm. Both boys shaking like they'd been pulled from freezing water. Getting the story out of them took time. Trevor kept starting and stopping, his words tangling with sobs. Kaylin could barely speak at all. But piece by piece, the nightmare took shape. A mask, a gun, 3 boys on bikes. 2 sent running, 1 taken. Vance had been in law enforcement for 23 years. He'd worked robberies, assaults, domestic situations that turned his stomach. But this child taken at gunpoint on a quiet residential road, this was different. This was every parent's worst fear made real. He radioed for backup. More units, search dogs, anyone available. Jacob's father sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, unable to look at anyone. His wife moved through the house in a daze, going to Jacob's room and coming back, going to the window and coming back like her body didn't know what to do with the terror flooding her system. Officers spread out across the neighborhood. Flashlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across yards, alleys, the wooded area where Trevor and Kaylin had hidden. They found nothing. No bikes, no clothing. No sign of struggle beyond the scuff marks on the gravel that could have been anything. The abduction site was less than half a mile from the house. Half a mile. Close enough that if Jacob had screamed, someone might have heard him, but no one heard anything. By midnight, the search had expanded to include neighboring counties. Volunteers poured in, parents, teachers, people who'd never met Jacob but couldn't stand the thought of doing. Nothing. They formed lines and walked through fields, calling his name until their voices went hoarse. The gravel road where it happened was cordoned off with yellow tape. In the harsh glare of portable lights, investigators combed every inch, photographing scuff marks, collecting samples of dirt and stone that would ultimately tell them nothing useful. Detective Silas Vance Baxter's younger brother and lead investigator for major crimes arrived just after 1 a.m. He stood at the abduction site for a long time, staring at the ground, at the trees, at the empty space where a boy had been. "We need to find him tonight," Baxter said, coming to stand beside him. if we don't find him tonight. I know. But they both already knew the truth. The man had at least a 4-hour head start. He could be in another state by now. He could be anywhere. And Jacob could be. Silas refused to finish that thought. If this happened on your street tonight, would you recognize the warning signs? Subscribe to stay ahead. Think about it. A masked man with a gun doesn't just appear out of nowhere. There are always patterns, always signs, always behavior that should have raised red flags, but only if you know what to look for. Not ready to subscribe? Drop a comment and tell us what's stopping you. Here as something that will make you uncomfortable. Some people said Trevor and Kaylin should have fought back. That 3 boys together could have overpowered one man. That they should have done anything instead of running. What would you have done? You're 9 and 10 years old. There's a gun pointed at you. A grown man in a mask is giving you orders in a voice that makes your blood freeze. Your brother is lying on the ground next to you. You have seconds to make a decision. Do you fight? Do you run? Do you freeze? It's easy to have opinions when you're watching from safety. It's different when gravel is cutting into your face and you can smell the gun oil and your heart is beating so hard you think it might stop. Those boys did what their instincts told them to do. They survived. Jacob didn't get that choice. And the man who took it from him, he was just getting started. By dawn, the neighborhood looked like a war zone. Police vehicles lined every street. Officers moved in coordinated groups, their radios crackling with constant updates that led nowhere. The command center, hastily set up in the elementary school gymnasium, buzzed with activity, as maps were, spread across tables and pins marked search zones. Sheriff Baxter Vance hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice ragged from shouting orders and making calls. He'd mobilized every resource the county had and called in favors from surrounding jurisdictions. State police, federal agents, K-9 units, helicopter support waiting for enough daylight to be useful. The scale of the response was unprecedented for this part of Minnesota. Nothing like this had ever happened here. They didn't have protocols for it. They didn't have experience with it. They were making it up as they went, praying that urgency and manpower would be enough. It wasn't. The volunteers came in waves. First the neighbors, then friends of the family, then people who'd heard about it on the early morning news and couldn't stay home. By midday Monday, there were over 300 civilians combing through the area. They searched everywhere. Cornfields that stretched for miles, the stalks dry and rustling in the October wind. Abandoned quarries filled with dark water that reflected nothing but sky. Tool sheds, barns, every empty building within a 10-mile radius. They walked in lines, arms spread wide so they wouldn't miss anything, calling Jacob's name until their throats burned. Some carried thermal blankets, preparing for the moment they'd find him cold and scared but alive. Others carried nothing but hope that was fading with every passing hour. The dogs picked up a scent near the abduction site and lost it 30 yards into the woods. Just stopped, confused, circling back to where the trail ended as if Jacob had simply ceased to exist at that point. No tire tracks on the hard-packed gravel. No witnesses beyond 2 traumatized boys who could barely describe what they'd seen. No physical evidence except scuff marks that could have been made by anyone. Detective Silas Vance stood in the middle of the search grid, watching volunteers disappear into fields and emerge empty-handed. He'd worked missing persons cases before. He knew the statistics. He knew that with every hour that passed, the likelihood of a good outcome dropped exponentially. They were approaching 24 hours, and they had nothing. The evidence or lack of it told a story that made Silas's blood run cold. This wasn't random. This wasn't some opportunistic crime where a man saw 3 boys and made a split-second decision. The location was too perfect. A dark stretch of road flanked by woods, far enough from houses that screams wouldn't carry, close enough to multiple escape routes that the kidnapper could vanish in any direction. The man had been waiting there, positioned, ready, which meant he'd known the boys would come through, or at least known that someone would. The forensics team worked the site for hours, collecting samples that would sit in evidence bags for weeks before being processed. In 1983, DNA analysis was barely emerging as a tool. They had fingerprint powder, plaster casts of shoe impressions that were too degraded to be useful, and photographs of a crime scene that looked like any other stretch of rural road. The bikes were gone, all three of them. That detail bothered Silas more than anything else. Why take the bikes? They were evidence, sure, but they were also cumbersome, difficult to transport quickly. Unless the man had a vehicle nearby. Unless he'd planned for that too. Press conferences started on Monday afternoon. Jacob's parents sat at a table with microphones pointed at them like accusations, pleading with whoever had taken their son to bring him home. His mother could barely speak. His father read from a prepared statement, his hands shaking so badly the paper rustled audibly. Tips started flooding in immediately. The hotline set up at the precinct rang constantly. Every caller had seen something, heard something, knew something. A suspicious van. A man acting strangely at a gas station. A neighbor who'd always seemed off. Silas assigned teams to follow up on every single lead. They chased hundreds of them in the first week alone. A van reported near the abduction site turned out to belong to a plumber working late. A suspicious man was a father searching for his own lost dog. A tip about someone burying something in their yard led to a time capsule a family had buried 5 years earlier. Dead end after dead end after dead end. By the end of week 1, the realization settled over the investigation like fog. They were looking for a ghost. The change happened overnight. Screen doors that had never been locked suddenly had deadbolts installed. Children who used to roam until dark were now kept within sight of their houses. Parents drove their kids to bus stops they used to walk to alone. Birthday parties that would have been held in backyards moved inside, with parents checking IDs of every guest. The trust that had defined the community evaporated like morning dew. Neighbors started watching each other differently. The man who lived alone and kept odd hours. The teenager who wore all black and listened to heavy metal. The guy who'd moved to town 6 months ago and didn't attend church. Anyone who deviated from normal became suspect. At the grocery store, mothers pulled their children closer when strangers smiled at them. At the park, fathers stood guard while the kids played, eyes scanning for threats that could be anyone, anywhere. The innocence of 1983 Minneapolis died with Jacob's disappearance, and something harder, something fearful, took its place. The legend started in schoolyards first, the way these things always do. Kids whispering to each other or obsessed, their voices dropping low when teachers walked by. The Shadow Man. He appears on dark roads when you're alone. He wears a mask so you can't see his face. He takes children and they're never seen again. Some said he lived in the abandoned house on Elm Street. Others said he drove a black van with no windows. A few claimed they'd seen him watching from the tree line behind their schools. None of it was true. All of it felt true. Parents tried to dismiss it as childish imagination, but they felt it too. That sense of something lurking just out of sight. Something patient and deliberate that understood their community better than they understood themselves. Because that was the most terrifying part. The man who took Jacob knew these roads. He knew when children would be out. He knew where to position himself for maximum coverage and minimum risk. He knew how to vanish without leaving a trace. He wasn't a stranger passing through. He was one of them. And that realization turned the community inside out. If the monster wasn't from somewhere else, if he was local, then he was still here. Still watching. Still waiting. Still winning. The Shadow Man had a real face behind that mask. They just didn't know whose face it was yet. Detective Silas Vance officially took over as lead investigator on day 3. At 38, he was young for the position, but he'd earned it through relentless work on cases others had written off as unsolvable. He had a reputation for never letting go, for carrying files home and staying up nights, connecting dots that seemed unconnectable. This case would become his obsession for the next 15 years. He cleared space in the investigation room, a converted conference area at the Minneapolis precinct, and started building what would become a massive web of information. Maps covered every wall, photographs pinned in clusters, timelines written in marker on whiteboards. Every reported sighting, every tip, every piece of information, no matter how small, got documented and cross-referenced. Agent Theron Thorne arrived from the State Bureau 4 days after the abduction. He was older than Silas, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of seeing the worst humanity had to offer. He'd worked child abduction cases across 3 states and brought expertise that the local department desperately needed. Their partnership was immediate and intense. While Silas worked the ground interviewing witnesses, following leads, coordinating searches, Darrow worked in psychology. He built profiles. He studied patterns. He looked for connections that weren't obvious on the surface, and he found something 2 months before Jacob disappeared. There had been incidents in Paynesville, a town 30 miles away. Young boys approached by a masked man. Some chased, some cornered, all of them escaping before anything worse happened. The reports had been filed by local officers who treated them as isolated events. Kids getting scared by a prankster, maybe. Someone's idea of a sick joke. The cases were never connected, never escalated, never investigated beyond taking statements. Theron spread those reports across Silas's desk on a gray Tuesday morning. "Look at the dates," he said. "Look at the descriptions." Silas looked. His stomach turned. Same type of mask. Same build. Same calm, controlled voice, according to the victims. He was practicing, Thorin said quietly, testing his approach, refining his method. But what they didn't know yet, what would become clear for more than a decade, was that the predator had been practicing for far longer than 2 months. And Jacob wasn't his first victim. He was just the first one who disappeared. 3 weeks after Jacob vanished, his face appeared on milk cartons across the country. It was a school photo from the previous spring. Jacob, smiling, a gap between his front teeth he'd been self-conscious about, but that his mother loved. The word missing printed above it in bold letters, followed by sparse details. Age, height, last seen wearing a red hockey jacket and blue jeans. The milk carton campaign was new, experimental. Jacob became one of the first missing children in America to have his face distributed this way, staring out from breakfast tables in homes thousands of miles from Minnesota. Parents in California, Texas, Florida would pour milk for their own children and see Jacob smile, feel a moment of gratitude mixed with horror that it wasn't their child, then move on with their day. But Jacob's mother, Patty, couldn't move on. She transformed overnight from a woman who lived a quiet suburban life into an advocate with a mission that bordered on fury. But grief could have destroyed her. Many people expected it to. Instead, it became fuel. She spoke at press conferences with a steadiness that unnerved reporters. She looked directly into cameras and addressed whoever had taken her son, her voice never wavering even when tears streamed down her face. She met with legislators demanding changes to how missing children cases were handled, how information was shared between departments, how quickly alerts went out. Her husband handled it differently. He retreated inward, unable to function in public, barely able to function at all. The contrast was stark. Patty everywhere, speaking to anyone who would listen, while he sat in Jacob's room for hours, not moving, not speaking, just existing in the space where his son should have been. The advocacy work gave Patty purpose when purpose was the only thing keeping her standing. She connected with other families whose children had vanished, forming networks that would eventually lead to national registries and federal legislation. Jacob's name would become synonymous with child safety laws, his legacy written in policy and procedure. But none of that brought him home. Every morning, Patty woke up in a house that was too quiet. Every night, she set the table for one fewer person. Every time the phone rang, her heart stopped, hoping it was news, dreading what that news might be. The investigation had become her entire world. Progress reports from Silas, updates from Thorin, new leads that materialized and dissolved like smoke. She memorized every detail, studied every theory, refused to accept that her son might never be found. Because accepting that meant accepting he was gone, and she wasn't ready for that, would never be ready for that. The investigation room at the Minneapolis precinct had become a shrine to futility. Every available surface held evidence of effort that led nowhere. File boxes stacked 6 feet high contained tips that had been followed, investigated, and ultimately dismissed. The walls were papered with maps of Minnesota, neighboring states, the entire Midwest, each one marked with colored pins representing sightings, suspects, search zones. Red pins for credible leads, yellow for possible connections, blue for areas already searched, green for suspects cleared. The sea of green grew larger every day. Silas spent 16-hour shifts in that room, surviving on coffee and the kind of determination that ate people alive from the inside. He developed a system for processing tips. Initial screening by phone, followed by field investigation for anything that passed basic credibility checks, then deep analysis if the lead showed promise. Out of every 1,000 tips that came through the hotline, 999 went nowhere. A woman in Iowa called to report seeing a boy matching Jacob's description at a rest stop. Investigators drove 4 hours to interview her. The boy turned out to be her nephew visiting from out of state, and she'd simply wanted attention. A prison inmate claimed to have information about Jacob's location. He'd trade it for a reduced sentence on his own charges. Silas sat across from him in an interrogation room for 3 hours, watching the man spin stories that contradicted themselves every 5 minutes. He knew nothing. He'd read about the case in the newspaper and saw an opportunity. A psychic called claiming to have visions of Jacob alive in a farmhouse near a lake. Silas assigned 2 officers to check properties matching that vague description. They found nothing but wasted time and angry homeowners who didn't appreciate police showing up based on supposed supernatural insight. Each dead end hurt. Each false lead was another day Jacob stayed missing. Another day the trail grew colder. Another day the odds of finding him alive dropped closer to 0. Theron brought structure to the chaos. He created databases before databases were standard practice, cross-referencing information manually that would later take computers seconds to process. He identified patterns in the noise, multiple reports from the same geographic area, descriptions that matched across unrelated tips, timelines that overlapped in meaningful ways. But even with organization, even with methodology, they were drowning in information that meant nothing. The evidence boards told the story. Hundreds of suspects investigated and cleared. Thousands of hours spent chasing ghosts. Tens of thousands of volunteer hours searching terrain that had already been searched twice before. And at the center of it all, taped to the wall directly in front of Silas's desk, was Jacob's school photo, the same one from the milk cartons. That gap-toothed smile staring out at empty chairs and cold coffee cups and men who were failing to bring him home. Silas refused to take it down, refused to move it to a file. Jacob would stay on that wall until Silas had answers. However long that took, Delbert Hewis never stood a chance. He was 47 years old, lived alone on 8 acres of property 3 miles from the abduction site, and kept to himself in a way that small-town Minnesota found suspicious. He didn't attend church. He didn't make small talk at the hardware store. He worked odd jobs, handyman work, yard maintenance, and drove a beat-up truck that sounded like it was dying every time he started it. When investigators started canvassing the area, Hewis's name came up repeatedly. Not because anyone had seen him do anything. Not because he had a criminal record, he didn't. But because he was different, quiet, unmarried, a little strange. In the absence of real suspects, strange was enough. Silas brought him in for questioning on week 2. Standard procedure. Hewis came willingly, answered every question, provided an alibi that placed him at a friend's house watching football the night Jacob was taken. The friend confirmed it. Phone records supported it. There was nothing connecting Hewis to the crime beyond proximity and the fact that he made people uncomfortable. Silas cleared him. The community did not. Someone leaked that Hewis had been questioned. The local newspaper ran a story that didn't name him directly, but provided enough details that everyone knew exactly who they meant. Local man questioned in Wetterling case. The headline read, and that was all it took. Within days, Hewis's property was under siege. Cars drove past slowly, occupants staring at his house like it was a carnival attraction. Someone spray painted "child killer" on his mailbox. His truck tires were slashed. Threatening letters arrived in his mailbox alongside grocery store flyers and utility bills. The witch hunt escalated when a group of parents organized a search of Hewis's land without permission or warrant. They showed up 50 strong on a Saturday morning, marching past no trespassing signs, convinced they'd find evidence police had missed. They found nothing because there was nothing to find, but the damage was done. Hewis lost clients who no longer wanted him on their properties. Neighbors who'd been cordial, if distant before now, would make eye contact. Someone threw a brick through his living room window at 2 a.m. with a note attached. "We know what you did." Silas tried to push back. He held a press conference specifically to state that Hewis was not a suspect, that he'd been thoroughly investigated and cleared, that the community needed to let the professionals handle the investigation. It didn't matter. The court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. Hewis became the face of the community's rage and helplessness. They couldn't find Jacob. They couldn't catch the real kidnapper. But they could make Delbert Hewis's life hell, and that gave them something to do with their fear and frustration. 6 months after Jacob's disappearance, Hewis sold his property at a loss and moved 2 states away. Not because he was guilty, because living in Minneapolis had become impossible. The real kidnapper remained free, watching the community tear itself apart over the wrong man, probably laughing at how easy it was to stay invisible when everyone was looking in the wrong direction. The Hewis incident was just the most visible crack in a community that was fracturing from the inside. Friendships that had lasted decades ended over arguments about who might be responsible. A husband and wife stopped speaking to their neighbors because the neighbor's teenage son wore black clothing and listened to music they didn't understand. A teacher was reported to police by parents who thought he paid too much attention to students. Never mind that he'd been teaching in the district for 15 years without a single complaint. Every man became a potential suspect. Every kind gesture was reinterpreted as predatory. The soccer coach who gave kids rides home after practice was suddenly doing something suspicious. The mailman who knew everyone's names and always had candy in his truck was now someone to avoid. Trust, once given freely, became impossible to earn. Parent groups formed to walk children to and from school in organized lines. Curfews were established and enforced. A proposal to install streetlights on every residential road passed with overwhelming support, funded by a special tax that no one objected to because what price was too high for safety. But the lights didn't bring safety. They just illuminated the fear more clearly. Most people ignore danger until it's too late. Don't be most people subscribe. The statistics were clear. Child abductions by strangers were rare, statistically improbable. But statistics meant nothing when Jacob's empty chair sat at the dinner table every night, when his trombone gathered dust in the corner, when his mother appeared on television pleading for information that never came. Still scrolling without subscribing? Comment why you're willing to risk being uninformed. Here is the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Was the community right to suspect Delbert Hewis? He was cleared by police, yes. His alibi checked out, yes, but he lived alone. He kept odd hours. He made people uncomfortable. Comment guilty or innocent on Hewis. Was the community right to suspect him? The truth is, they needed someone to blame, someone to focus their rage on. Because the alternative, accepting that the real kidnapper was still out there, possibly someone they knew well, someone they trusted, was too terrifying to process. So they chose Hewis. They chose the outsider. They chose wrong, and while they were destroying an innocent man's life, the actual predator went about his business undisturbed. He watched the news coverage. He read the newspaper articles. He saw the community eating itself alive with suspicion and fear. And he felt safe. Because if they were this wrong about Hewis, this convinced of guilt based on nothing but gut feeling and prejudice, then they'd never find him. He was too smart for them. Too careful. Too patient. He'd proven it by taking Jacob and leaving no trace. He'd proven it by watching them chase their tails for months while he remained invisible. The Shadow Man wasn't just a legend. He was real, he was local, and he was winning. Agent Theron Thorne sat in the investigation room at 3 a.m, surrounded by files that officially had nothing to do with Jacob's case. The Painesville incidents. He'd requested them weeks ago from the small town police department 30 miles away. They'd arrived in a cardboard box, handwritten reports on carbon paper, the kind of documentation that predated computerized systems. Minor incidents. Kid stuff. according to the officers who'd filed them. But Theron didn't see kid stuff. He saw a pattern. September 1983. A 12-year-old boy approached by a masked man while walking home from a friend's house. The man grabbed him, but the boy screamed and fought. The man released him and disappeared into nearby woods. Report filed. No follow-up investigation. October 1983. Two boys, ages 10 and 11, cornered in an alley by a masked man who demanded they come with him. They ran. He didn't chase. Report filed. Officers concluded it was probably a prank. October 22nd, 1983. Jacob Wetterling taken at gunpoint on a gravel road outside Minneapolis. Theron spread the reports across the table in chronological order. The descriptions matched too closely to be coincidence. Same type of mask, dark, crude eye holes. Same build, average height, average weight, unremarkable. Same voice calm, controlled, no emotion. But it was the progression that made Theron's blood run cold. First incident, physical contact, but released when the victim resisted. Second incident, verbal commands, but no physical contact, and victims fled. Third incident, weapon introduced. Full abduction, no release. He was learning, Theron said aloud to the empty room. Each encounter taught him something. What worked? What didn't? How children reacted under different circumstances. How much force was necessary. How to refine his approach. Jacob wasn't the first target. He was the successful culmination of months, maybe years of practice. Silas arrived at 6 a.m. to find Theron still there, surrounded by reports and coffee cups. Tell me, Silas said. Theron walked him through it. The timeline, the descriptions, the evolution from opportunistic attempts to calculated abduction. He's not a drifter, Theron concluded. Drifters don't practice, they don't refine. They take opportunities where they find them and move on. So, what is he? A predator in residence. The phrase hung in the air between them. He lives here, Theron continued. He knows the area. He knows when kids are out, where they go, which routes are isolated. He has patience enough to wait for the right opportunity and disciplined enough to walk away when conditions are imperfect. Silas stared at the reports. Everything they'd assumed about the case, that it was random, that the kidnapper was long gone, was wrong. He's still here, Silas said quietly. He's still here, Theron confirmed. He's been here the whole time. And if we don't find him soon, he'll do it again. The investigation was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. DNA profiling existed in 1983, but barely. The technology was experimental, expensive, and available only to major federal agencies with budgets that dwarfed what Minneapolis could access. The kind of genetic analysis that would become routine 20 years later, matching a single hair, a drop of blood. A fiber was science fiction to the investigators working Jacob's case. They had fingerprint powder. They had plaster casts. They had photographs taken with cameras that required manual focus and produced images that turned grainy when enlarged beyond postcard size. The surveillance footage that existed, and there wasn't much, was captured on VHS tape that degraded every time it was reviewed. A gas station 2 miles from the abduction site had a camera pointed at the pumps. Investigators watched hours of blurry footage showing vehicles that could have been any color, occupied by people who could have been anyone. Computerized databases were just beginning to emerge in law enforcement. Most departments still kept records on paper, filed in cabinets, cross-referenced manually. If a suspect moved from Minnesota to Wisconsin, there was no automatic flag. If someone in Iowa committed a similar crime, Minneapolis might not hear about it for months, if at all. Information sharing between departments happened through phone calls and faxed documents. Tips from other states arrived on paper that curled at the edges. Details sometimes illegible, follow-up requiring long-distance calls that ate through budgets. Silas spent countless hours on the phone with other agencies, building networks that should have existed already. He created his own crude database using index cards, thousands of them, each one documenting a tip, a suspect, a lead. He could cross-reference faster than the official systems, but it was still painfully slow compared to what would be possible just a decade later. The technology gap wasn't just frustrating. It was potentially fatal to the investigation. Evidence that could have identified the kidnapper in 2000 sat in storage in 1985, useless until science caught up. Witnesses who might have been found through social media or cell phone records in later years remained anonymous because those tools didn't exist yet. They were hunting a predator with tools designed for a different era, and the predator knew it. He counted on it. Every few months, hope would flare up like a match struck in darkness, only to be snuffed out just as quickly. 1987. A hiker found bone fragments in a wooded area 40 miles from the abduction site. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. Silas drove there personally, his heart hammering the entire way, praying he'd find answers and praying even harder that he wouldn't. The forensics team worked for 3 days. The bones were sent to the state lab for analysis. Results came back 2 weeks later. Deer bones, not human, not Jacob. 1989. A prison inmate in Illinois claimed he had information about Jacob's burial site. He said he'd been part of a trafficking ring, that he knew exactly where the body was hidden, that he'd testify in exchange for a transfer to a facility closer to his family. Silas flew to Illinois, sat across from the man in an orange jumpsuit, listened to his story for 6 hours across 2 days. The details were specific enough to seem credible descriptions of terrain, landmarks, distances. They organized a search based on his directions. They found nothing. When pressed, the inmate's story changed, then changed again. He knew nothing. He de-read about the case in newspapers and concocted a story he thought would get him what he wanted. Another dead end. Another wave of crushing disappointment. 1991. A woman in South Dakota called to report that her neighbor had a boy living with him who looked like Jacob. The neighbor was secretive, she said. The boy never went to school. She was certain something was wrong. Officers from 3 jurisdictions converged on the property. The boy turned out to be the man's nephew from Colorado, visiting for the summer. Legal, documented. Nothing suspicious except a paranoid neighbor who'd convinced herself she'd cracked a famous case. Each false lead took its toll on Silas, on the family, on the volunteers who still showed up for occasional searches, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. Patty held press conferences on every anniversary of Jacob's disappearance. October 22nd became a day of renewed attention. Television crews would show up. Newspapers would run retrospectives, and for a week or two, tips would flood in again. Most of them were from people who meant well, but had nothing useful to offer. Some were from attention seekers. A few were from genuinely disturbed individuals who believed their own delusions. The signal-to-noise ratio was brutal. Somewhere in the thousands of useless tips might be the one piece of information that cracked the case wide open. But finding it was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. January 1995, 12 years after Jacob vanished. The official designation came down from the department brass on a Friday afternoon. The memo was clinical, bureaucratic, stripped of emotion, due to resource constraints and lack of active leads. The Wetterling investigation will be reclassified as a cold case, effective immediately. The task force that had once numbered 30 officers was reduced to 2. Silas and 1 part-time analyst who split her hours between Jacob's case and 3 others. The investigation room was emptied. Maps came down from walls. File boxes, hundreds of them, were loaded onto carts and wheeled to the basement storage area. Years of work, thousands of hours of investigation, packed away like seasonal decorations nobody wanted to look at anymore. Silas stood in the empty room after the movers left. Bare walls, clean desks, fluorescent lights humming overhead. It felt like a tomb. The department needed the space. Budget cuts meant consolidation. Active cases took priority. Jacob's case had gone 12 years without a break, without significant progress, without anything except dead ends and false hope. From a resource management perspective, scaling back made sense. From a human perspective, it felt like giving up. The public reaction was immediate and angry. Patty appeared on every local news station, her voice shaking with rage she rarely showed. "My son is still missing," she said, looking directly into the camera. "The man who took him is still out there. And you're telling me we're just going to stop looking?" The department issued statements about cases never truly being closed, about how they'd continue to follow leads as they emerged, about commitment to finding answers. Empty words. Everyone knew what cold case meant. It meant the investigation was over unless something extraordinary happened. It meant Jacob would sit in storage alongside dozens of other unsolved cases. It meant the kidnapper had won. Officers who had worked the case for years were reassigned. Some transferred to other departments. Some retired. The institutional knowledge who had been interviewed, which leads had been exhausted, what theories had been explored, scattered across the state. The machine that had been built to find Jacob was dismantled piece by piece. And somewhere in Minnesota, a man who had been holding his breath for 12 years finally exhaled. He'd made it. He was safe. The case was cold, and with it, his trail. Silas Vance didn't get the memo. Or rather, he got it and ignored it. Jacob's school photo stayed taped to his desk, right there in the center, where he'd see it first thing every morning and last thing before leaving at night. That gap-toothed smile, those freckles. A boy who'd been 11 years old for 12 years because time had stopped for him on a gravel road in 1983. Other officers moved on. Silas couldn't. He worked his assigned cases during the day robberies, assaults, the routine crimes that kept a detective busy. But nights and weekends belonged to Jacob. He'd spread the files across his kitchen table, reviewing interviews he'd conducted years ago, looking for details he might have missed the first time, the 10th time, the 100th time. His wife worried. His kids learned not to ask about work. His friends stopped inviting him to social events he'd decline anyway because he had work to do, always work to do, work that never ended and never got anywhere. But he couldn't let go, wouldn't let go, because someone had to remember. Someone had to care when the department moved on, when the media stopped calling, when the public's attention shifted to newer tragedies. Minneapolis had adapted to its new reality. The heightened security measures that seemed extreme in 1984 had become standard by 1995. Locked doors, supervised children, stranger danger education in schools. A generation of kids grew up never knowing the freedom their older siblings had experienced. The community had been permanently changed by Jacob's disappearance, but the acute terror had faded into chronic caution. Life went on. It had to. Parents still let their children play outside, just within eyesight now. Kids still rode bikes, just not alone and never after dark. The neighborhood gathering still happened, but with an undercurrent of vigilance that hadn't existed before. The Shadow Man legend persisted among children, but it had become mythologized, abstracted, less real than it had felt in those first terrifying months. He was the boogeyman now, a cautionary tale, not an immediate threat that might be watching from the trees. And somewhere in that comfortable complacency, the real man, not the legend. But the flesh and blood predator who'd taken Jacob lived his life undisturbed, going to work, coming home, blending in, confident that time had buried his secrets forever. He was wrong. But winter 1998 would change everything? What investigators found next nobody saw coming. Not because it was complicated. Not because it required breakthrough technology or brilliant detective work. But because the answer had been sitting in their files since 1983, buried under 12 years of more promising leads that went nowhere. The Shadow Man had aged, 15 years older now, grayer, slower. Maybe he thought about Jacob sometimes. Maybe he didn't. Predators don't lose sleep over their victims the way normal people lose sleep over their mistakes. He'd watch the investigation from a distance, read the newspaper articles, saw Delbert Hewis destroyed by public suspicion, watch the task force scale back, observe the case go cold. Every year that passed without arrest made him more confident. Every false lead the police chased proved he was smarter than them. Every press conference where Patty pleaded for information was evidence that he'd won. He'd committed the perfect crime, taken a child in front of witnesses and vanished without leaving a trace worth following. For 15 years, he was untouchable. But here's what he didn't know. Cold cases don't stay cold forever. Technology advances. New investigators bring fresh eyes. One overlooked detail can unravel everything. and Dr. Eris Thorne, a forensic specialist who D made a career out of solving the unsolvable, was about to walk into Silas Vance's office with a file that would change everything. The Shadow Man's perfect crime was about to become his greatest mistake. Winter 1998. Silas Vance was 53 years old and 6 months from mandatory retirement. 15 years on Jacob's case. 15 years of carrying files home. 15 years of that school photo staring at him from his desk. A constant reminder of failure that he wore like a second skin. His colleagues threw him a pre-retirement party. Cake in the break room, speeches about his dedication, a plaque thanking him for his service. Everyone carefully avoided mentioning the one case that had defined his career, the one he'd never solved. Silas accepted the plaque, ate the cake, shook hands, and went right back to work. Because retirement meant leaving Jacob in that basement with the other cold cases. It meant admitting defeat. It meant the kidnapper won, and Silas got to live out his golden years knowing D failed an 11-year-old boy and his family. That wasn't acceptable. He'd made a promise to himself 15 years ago, standing on that gravel road with Trevor and Kellen's testimony still ringing in his ears. He would find the man who did this, however long it took, whatever it cost. 6 months wasn't enough time to solve a 15-year-old cold case. Everyone knew that. The odds were astronomical. The trail was ice cold. The evidence had been picked over by dozens of investigators who found nothing. But Silas had one advantage nobody else had. He'd lived with this case longer than anyone. He knew every detail, every dead end, every theory that had been explored and abandoned. The case wasn't just in files for him, it was in his head, complete and accessible. And he had a new ally. Dr. Eris Thorne had contacted him 3 weeks earlier. Not the agent Theron Thorne who'd worked the case in the 80s, no relation. This was someone different, younger, a forensic specialist who D made a name solving cold cases in 3 states using emergent DNA technology, and behavioral analysis that hadn't existed when Jacob disappeared. Thorne had read about the case, studied the files, and called Silas with words that made his heart skip. "I think I can help." Silas invited him to Minneapolis immediately. They had 6 months. It would have to be enough. Dr. Eris Thorne arrived on a Tuesday morning carrying 3 boxes of equipment that looked like something from a science fiction film. DNA analysis had evolved dramatically since 1983. What once required massive labs and weeks of processing could now be done faster, cheaper, and with smaller samples. Genetic markers that were impossible to identify 15 years ago now yielded clear results. Database matching that hadn't existed was now becoming standard. Thorne specialized in extracting viable DNA from evidence that other labs had dismissed as too degraded, too old. He de-solved a 10-year-old murder in Oregon by pulling usable genetic material from a cigarette butt that had been sitting in an evidence locker, exposed to temperature fluctuations and humidity that should have destroyed it. If anyone could find something in Jacob's evidence, it was him. They started with the basics. Every piece of physical evidence collected from the abduction site was pulled from storage, soil samples, fabric fibers, photographs, the plaster casts of shoe, impressions. Even the bags that had held the evidence were tested, in case handling 15 years ago had left traces. Most of it yielded nothing, degraded beyond usefulness, contaminated by poor storage practices that were standard in 1983, but wouldn't pass modern protocols. But Thorne wasn't just looking for DNA, he was looking for patterns. He requested files from surrounding jurisdictions, not just the Painesville incidents that Theron had identified years ago, but everything within a 100-mile radius that involved attempted abductions, suspicious approaches to children, assault cases that matched any element of Jacob's kidnapping. The pile grew. 20 cases, 30, 45. Thorne spread them across the empty investigation room that Silas had requisitioned for this final push. He built timelines, geographic maps, behavioral profiles. He was looking for the invisible thread that connected them, the pattern that human eyes might miss but that data analysis could reveal. Most investigators work forward, Thorne explained, marker in hand, drawing connections between cases on a whiteboard. They start with the crime and try to find the perpetrator, I work backward. I assume the perpetrator exists and try to map his footprint. Silas watched him work. This was different from anything they'd tried before. Not just new technology, but a new way of thinking about the case. Show me the Painesville incidents again, Thorne said. Silas pulled the files. The same ones Agent Theron had identified in the 80s. Boys approached by a masked man. September through October 1983. All within weeks of Jacob's abduction. Thorne read them slowly, making notes. Then he looked up. There's a name that appears in multiple reports. Did anyone follow up on him? Danny Heinrich? The name meant nothing to Silas at first. He'd interviewed hundreds of people over 15 years. Thousands of names had crossed his desk. Heinrich didn't trigger any immediate recognition. Thorne spread 3 incident reports across the table. September 1983, Painesville. A boy reports being chased by a masked man. The responding officer notes that a Daniel Heinrich lives 2 blocks from where the incident occurred. Officer drives by Heinrich's residence, sees nothing suspicious, makes a note of the report. No follow-up. He pulled out a second report. October 1983, different Painesville incident. Same officer responds. Same notation about Heinrich living nearby. This time the officer actually knocks on Heinrich's door. Heinrich answers, says he was home all evening, has no information about any masked man. Officer leaves. Still no follow-up. Third report. October 22nd, 1983. Jacob Wetterling abducted. During the initial canvassing, Heinrich's name comes up because he lives within 5 miles of the abduction site. He's brought in for questioning 3 days later. Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. I don't remember interviewing anyone named Heinrich. You didn't. This was before you took over as lead. Sheriff Baxter Vance conducted the interview personally. Thorne pulled out a yellowed interview transcript. Silas read it, his jaw tightening with each line. The interview lasted 27 minutes. Heinrich stated he was home alone the night of the abduction. No witnesses to confirm his alibi. No one who could verify his whereabouts. When asked if he owned any masks or firearms, he said no. When asked if he'd ever been to the area where Jacob was taken, he said maybe once or twice. The interview ended with a note from Baxter Vance. Subject, cooperative. No clear connection to incident. Other leads appear more promising. That's it, Silas said, his voice barely controlled. 27 minutes and they moved on. Gets worse, Thorne said. He pulled out another document. Heinrich was questioned again in 1989 about an unrelated assault on a boy in Cold Spring. Different jurisdiction, different investigators. They didn't know about the 1983 interview. He provided another flimsy alibi. They cleared him again. Silas stood up, pacing. 15 years. This man's name had been in their files since day 3, connected to multiple incidents involving masked men and young boys, and nobody had dug deeper. Nobody had connected the dots. Why didn't anyone follow up? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Because they had Delbert Hewis, Thorne said quietly. They had a suspect who made people uncomfortable, who lived close by, who seemed guilty. So they focused on him while Heinrich faded into the background. Silas felt sick. How many hours had been wasted on Hewis? How many resources poured into investigating a man who had nothing to do with it while the real kidnapper walked free? Where is Heinrich now? Silas asked. Thorne pulled out a current address. Still in Minnesota. Same town he was living in back in 1983. Still here. All this time. They couldn't just arrest Heinrich based on suspicion and proximity. Not after 15 years. Not without evidence. But they didn't need to arrest him for Jacob's abduction to get what they needed. The tip came from an unexpected source, a former acquaintance of Heinrich's who read about a different case in the newspaper and called the police with information about an assault from 1989. Not Jacob. A different boy. A different incident. But it was enough. The assault he described matched one of the cases Thorne had pulled Cold Spring, 1989. The victim had been attacked but escaped. No arrests were ever made. The case went cold like so many others. But now there was a witness willing to testify that Heinrich had made incriminating statements about assault. Statements that placed him at the scene. Statements that suggested knowledge only the perpetrator would have. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall they've been throwing themselves against for 15 years. Silas and Thorne worked with the prosecutor's office for 2 weeks, building a case for a search warrant. Not for Jacob's abduction, they didn't have enough for that yet. For the 1989 assault, for the Painesville incidents, for a pattern of behavior that suggested Heinrich was far more dangerous than the cursory 1983 interview had indicated. The warrant was approved on a Wednesday in late February 1998. They would search Heinrich's property, his vehicles, his place of employment, and crucially, they would be authorized to collect a DNA sample. DNA that could be compared against any evidence from Jacob's case. From the Painesville incidents, from the Cold Spring assault, from any unsolved case where genetic material had been recovered. The technology existed now. The databases existed now. The ability to definitively link Heinrich to these crimes existed now in a way it hadn't in 1983. The search was scheduled for Saturday morning, coordinated with multiple jurisdictions. Every officer briefed on what they were looking for. Masks, firearms, anything that connected to the incidents spanning 15 years. Silas didn't sleep the night before. He sat in his kitchen with Jacob's file spread across the table. The same file he'd carried for 15 years and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. Heinrich might have destroyed evidence years ago. The DNA might not match. The search might yield nothing useful. This could be another dead end in a case full of them. But for the first time in years, Silas felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope, real hope, based on evidence and patterns and science, not just desperate optimism. They were close. He could feel it. Saturday morning couldn't come fast enough. Subscribers see patterns others miss. Join them before you become a statistic. Think about what just happened here. Danny Heinrich's name appeared in files from 1983. Multiple files, multiple incidents, multiple red flags. And for 15 years, nobody connected them. Not because the investigators were incompetent, not because the information wasn't there, but because they were looking at pieces instead of the whole picture. They saw individual incidents as isolated events instead of chapters in the same story. We've all seen cold cases warm up, but this was different. This wasn't new evidence emerging from nowhere. This wasn't a deathbed confession or a witness finally coming forward. This was old evidence sitting in basement storage, waiting for someone with the right tools and the right perspective to see what had always been there. The pattern was invisible until it wasn't. And here's what should terrify you. How many other cases are sitting in storage right now with the answers already documented? It's just waiting for someone to connect the dots. How many other predators are living quiet suburban lives, confident they got away with it while their names sit in files that nobody's reviewing? The system isn't designed to catch people like Heinrich. It's designed to catch the obvious criminals. The ones who make mistakes. The ones who fit the profile. People like Heinrich, average, unremarkable, patient, they slip through the cracks. Until they don't. The arrest happened at 6:47 a.m. on Saturday, February 28, 1998. By 9 a.m., every news station in Minnesota had broken into regular programming with the announcement. A 53-year-old man had been arrested in connection with multiple assaults on children dating back to 1983, including potential involvement in the Jacob Wetterling case. They didn't release Heinrich's name immediately. Just his age, his location, the fact that he'd lived in the area for decades. The community's reaction was instant and electric. Phone lines at the Minneapolis precinct jammed with calls. Some from people claiming they'd always suspected something. Others from neighbors wanting to know if the arrested man lived near them. A few from reporters demanding details that hadn't been cleared for release. By noon, Heinrich's name had leaked. By 2 p.m., news vans were parked outside his house, a modest single-story ranch in a neighborhood that looked like every other middle-class subdivision in Minnesota. Neat lawns, 2-car garages, basketball hoops and driveways. Normal. Completely, utterly normal. Cameras captured footage that would play on loop for weeks. Heinrich's empty driveway, yellow crime scene tape stretched across the front door, investigators and windbreakers carrying boxes of evidence to unmarked vehicles. Neighbors gathered on the street, some in bathrobes because they'd been home when the police arrived before dawn. Others who'd rushed back when they heard the news. They spoke to reporters in voices tinged with disbelief. "He seemed so quiet," one woman said. "Kept to himself, but in a normal way. Not creepy or anything." A man who lived 3 houses down shook his head. "I've waved to that guy for years. He helped me jump my car battery once." Another neighbor. "My kids used to play in the yard next to his house. He never bothered them, never said anything inappropriate. He was just there." That was the word everyone kept using. There. Present, but unremarkable. The kind of person you DC at the hardware store or the gas station and forget about 5 minutes later. The kind of person who could commit unspeakable acts and then blend back into suburban life as if nothing had happened. Because that's exactly what he'd done. For 15 years, Danny Heinrich worked in maintenance at a manufacturing plant. Steady job, decent pay, showed up on time, did his work, went home. His supervisor described him as reliable but forgettable, the kind of employee who never caused problems but never stood out either. He shopped at the same grocery store every week, usually on Wednesday evenings, always polite to cashiers, always paid in cash, bought ordinary things, bread, milk, frozen dinners for one. He got his hair cut at the barbershop on Main Street, sat in the same chair every 6 weeks, made small talk about the weather, about sports teams he didn't actually follow, tipped exactly 15%. He lived alone, never married, no children. Neighbors assumed he was divorced or simply preferred solitude. Nothing strange about that. Plenty of people lived alone. His house was clean but sparse. Generic furniture that looked like it came from a discount store. Beige walls with no personal photographs. A television, a radio. Appliances that worked but weren't new. Nothing that suggested money problems or unusual habits. The banality was almost offensive in its completeness. This wasn't the monster from horror movies. This wasn't someone whose eyes held visible evil or whose behavior screamed danger. This was a man who could stand behind you at the post office and you wouldn't give him a second thought. That's what made it so terrifying. Evil isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears khakis and a flannel shirt. Sometimes it drives a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked windshield. Sometimes it says, "Excuse me," when reaching past you for a can of soup at the grocery store.